This week's Parashat Beshalach, describes Israel's leaving the land of Egypt. Shortly after they leave, the Egyptians, Paro and his host, change their minds and pursue them. And Israel finds itself standing in front of the Sea of Reeds, Yam Suf. In front of them is the water. Behind them is the Egyptian army with the chariots and the horsemen. And they cry to Moshe, "Why did you take us out of Egypt? It would have been better to remain there. Aren't there graves in the land of Egypt?" And Moshe cries out to God, and God says, "Why do you cry to me? Keep on moving forward." And they walk into the water split before them. They pass through the waters. The Egyptian army that pursues them is drowned in the waters. And after they cross, we have recorded in the Torah a song. Shirat Hayam, Az Yashim Moshe V'nei Yisrael, a song of rejoicing at God's triumph as witnessing the destruction of the army of their pursuers. And the end of the song calls for a crossing over to the other side. Ad Ya'avaram Cha Hashem, Ad Ya'avaram Zukanita, this nation that God has created will cross over to the other side. In the words of the song, T'vi'emo v'tita'emo b'har nachlatcha, you shall bring them to the mountain of your habitation. Machon v'shivtecha pa'alta Hashem, mikdash Hashem konenu yodecha, to God's temple that God's hands have wrought. Hashem yimloch yolam v'ed, God will reign eternal. That is to say, it speaks of a crossing over, of entering into God's holy habitation, God's mikdash, the temple which God will build with God's own hands, and where it can be said that God reigns eternally. So very briefly, I wanted to address 2 points about Shirat Hayam, Shabbat Shira, the Sabbath of Song, and to say 2 things. First of all, the function of song in the biblical narrative. The song, and in particular Shirat Hayam, is written differently than the rest of the Torah. The song contains words and also spaces. It looks different. And part of that has to do with the function of song. The function of song, or some of the songs in the Bible, they serve as a kind of break. They serve to mark a threshold in time, an important moment. And this moment is the moment that it can be truly said that Israel has left behind the land of Egypt, the experience of Mitzrayim. As Moses says to them in this week's Parsha, "As you have seen the Egyptians today, lo tosifun l'rotam od ad olam, you will not see them again. God will fight for you. Hashem yilachem lachem." So the song marks the end of the Egypt experience, of the bondage, of the suffering, of being a stranger, and begins the new stage in the Torah, which is walking through the desert, which begins right after Shirat Hayam. To mark that, to make that point, the Torah marks it with song. That's one of the functions of song. I would add that later in the Torah, in Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers, chapter 21, we have Shirat HaBe'er, kind of very short and parallel song. There it starts, Oz Yashir Yisrael, Israel sang at that point. Here it's Oz Yashir Moshe V'nei Yisrael. The differences are very interesting. But what's in common is that Shirat HaBe'er is a little song that appears just before the battle, successful battle, against Sichon, the king of Amori, which is the beginning of the conquest of the land. In the Torah, the battle of Sichon and then of Og, in chapter 21 of Bamidbar, referenced elsewhere in the Bible, is the beginning of the conquest of the land. To make that point, that there's this threshold in time where we move to a new stage of development, the Torah marks it with song. So that's one of the functions of song. But this particular song is interesting for many other reasons, and one of them is this. The end of the Shirah, the end of this song, which Moses and Israel sing, a song which focuses completely upon God and God's miraculous deliverance of Israel and God's vanquishing of God's enemies. It ends with God bringing God's people to God's temple, the temple that you will, God, will build with your own hands. Mikdash Hashem konenu yodecha, the temple where God will reign eternal. And what is interesting is that this threshold in time, this end of Exodus part 1, bears a very striking similarity to the end of the book of Exodus part 2, because the book of Exodus also ends with the temple. also ends with a Mishkan. That Mishkan is not built by God's hands. The temple in the second half of the book, the conclusion of the book of Exodus, is about the temple that the people build. The men, the women, the architects together bring their gifts and are able to construct a space in which God can be present, in a space that accompanies them throughout the desert. What that points to, among other things, is that for the book of Exodus, as the Ramban, as Nachmanides has emphasized, the goal of the book of Exodus and the goal of the song are the same. The goal is Mikdash Hashem. The goal is God's holy habitation. Whether it's built by God in the first part of the book, or whether it's built by the people following God's instruction in the second part of the book, the goal of the book is to create holy spaces. That's the end point of the journey. The holy space, I would add, in each case, involves either song, represented by song in the first part. In the second part, it involves people bringing their various gifts, their artistic talents, their whole self into the project. That's our goal. But as we know, as we begin the journey in the second half of the book of Exodus, which begins with the bitter waters of Marah, there will be many, many trials and tribulations along the way, many struggles. Among them, the golden calf and the whole experience of the golden calf. So the book, this week's parasha, reminds us that we have to celebrate what we've accomplished to this point, but also begins the next stage of the Torah, the difficult journey, the trials of the desert. So we have much to look ahead towards in the book of Exodus, until we arrive at the culmination of the book of Exodus, the temple that our hands have wrought, the Mishkan, V'yasuli Mikdash, you shall make the temple. That's our responsibility. And God says, V'shachati b'tocham, I will dwell amongst them, amongst the people that build the temple. Shabbat Shalom.